the Islamic fundamentalists, pretty damn prone to bring all of the problems that they had in their own country along with them. The West is under assault.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. If you're watching this video and it's Salah time, please pause it and go pray and come back when you're done. Please check out the description section of this video to support the channel. The supervillains that dwell in conservative Zionist swamps of the internet have united once again. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Jordan Peterson and Gutless Murray came together at the bidding of Islamophobic midget Ben Shapiro under the banner of the Israeli Wire, aka the Daily Liar, to bring you the latest rendition of Zionist propaganda. The most hilarious part of this sit-down, apart from it being disguised as an intellectual discussion, was how Murray and Peterson constantly contradicted themselves whilst trying to pin the problems of the West on outside influences, mainly of the Islamic variety, while at the same time citing Western-created problems for their own decline. And as a Western Muslim living in the West, I find it fascinating how they also try to include Israel as being part of the West, despite it being in the Middle East. While I suppose Israel does drain Western nations of their taxes and resources, and most of the illegal settlers that move there are from the West, so maybe that's what qualifies Israel in the beady eyes of JP and Dougie Boy. That, and of course they're on the Zionist payroll to be pro-Israel. Let's look at the first clip where these two scoundrels call pro-Palestinian protesters Hamas sympathizers.
An assault on the West is an assault on everything that isn't nihilistic, catastrophic, and authoritarian in its essence. Assessing also the strange union of the radical leftists with the Islamic fundamentalists. In what manner do you view what happened in October 7th, on October 7th and afterwards, as a reflection of the sorts of things that you were warning about in War on the West?
Since 7th of October, we've seen unbelievable scenes on everywhere from the streets of London and major cities in Europe to the most elite campuses of Northern America, Ivy League campuses, where students who have the most privileged existence imaginable have decided to openly throw their lot in with the terrorists of Hamas.
If there was a God, is it more logical to conceive of him as good or as evil? What's the cardinal call to existence? And my sense is that it's something akin to adventure. Maybe it's romantic adventure, which is an even better formulation. If that's not being pursued, what beckons as an ersatz alternative? And like certainly protest in the name of ideology.
It does show a rot somewhere, at elite institutions. One of the other students at Columbia said that it started the year out as a protest in October against the climate emergency. Within a month, it was Hamas.
So Jordan opened with the statement that any criticism of the West is a criticism of what is good and right. This is a ridiculous comment, as every country and culture has room for improvement and will have both positives and negatives. What is even more ridiculous is later in the video, Jordan goes on to criticize Western-made ideas like gender confusion, immigration, and the rainbow community, which is technically criticizing the West and totally contradicts his initial statement. But more about that later. You'll have noticed that Jordan lumped together leftists and Islamists, as he calls Muslims that follow their religion, in regard to their support for Palestine. Let's be clear, there are plenty of conservatives that stand with Palestine also. There is no alliance. It's simply a matter of people being against the slaughter of children and civilians. It doesn't matter your background or beliefs, all our moral compasses should align on this, even if our respective ideologies disagree on other issues. Jordan and Douglas then continued their pro-Israel PR campaign by speaking about peaceful pro-Palestinian protests and calling them support for Hamas, when in reality all they are is a call to stop the heinous genocide in Palestine and nothing more. Jordan then questioned the existence of God and equated the purpose of life to being about adventure, and in his opinion that lack of adventure is what is causing people to protest for Palestine, and Douglas of course wholeheartedly agreed with this. Okay boys, so it's got nothing to do with the lifeless bodies of kids and babies we are all seeing on a daily basis online, and bear in mind the universities these two are speaking against are again Western inventions, which I commend the West for having, as it encourages the freedom of ideas. Let's look at the next clip where these two ragamuffins justify the recent riots in the UK, as well as salute their fellow Zionist Tommy Robinson.
Tammy and I went out on a limb recently and interviewed Tommy Robinson.
I saw.
Now that was before the recent march that Robinson and his crew organized in London. I thought his crew handled that extraordinarily well. Now, in the aftermath of those protests, of course, all sorts of chaotic hell has broken loose.
Protests started peacefully at first, then some violent. A mosque was targeted nearby, and then violence started to spread out to other towns. Then Muslim communities started to arm up to defend their areas. When people said in recent days, how could anyone leap to such a conclusion that the attacker would be, and you go, because everyone's seen this before. You know, people don't actually forget very fast. The media class may, but they don't forget very fast that it's only 7 years ago that the son of Libyan migrants to the UK went and detonated a suicide bomb at an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. They don't forget fast that 3 people who had no right to be in the UK, including one whose asylum claim had been rejected, but who was nowhere near being deported, went across London Bridge in 2017, hacking at the throats of passers-by and shouting Allahu Akbar. But if you're a Tommy Robinson character and you're white and working class, what are you allowed to do about this? What are you allowed to say about any of this? And the government, for decades now, has had the attitude, you're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to say anything. You can't do anything, because if you do, we'll call you a racist.
Jordan seems to be under the impression Tommy's march went well. He must have missed the arrests of drunken yobs, the Islamophobic chanting, and people urinating en masse in the streets of London. I mean, I suppose it did go well in the context that it ended with Tommy being arrested for terrorism. It was hilarious to see Murray squirm in his chair whilst trying to describe the rioters in a somewhat good light, and at the same time describe Muslims arming up, as he put it. Just look at the stats for the violence and vandalism, and it's clear the rioters were the main aggressors. Murray continued in this vein by justifying not only the riots, but the online disinformation and the discriminatory reaction to it by citing previous acts of extremism from 7 years ago involving individuals who claim to be Muslim. Firstly, most Muslims condemn all acts of extremism, especially those done in the name of our religion. So if we employ Murray's thinking and look for historical events to justify a prejudicial reaction towards non-Muslims, we don't have to go back 7 years. We can look back a few days to do so. However, we shouldn't stereotype non-Muslims like Douglas does to Muslims, because it's wrong to do so, and we should deal with each case on an individual basis. The fact is, the majority of Muslims in the UK and in the West are just regular people who would never commit an act of extremism, and this is statistically proven. Douglas then went on to say people like Tommy Robinson and his followers can't say anything against ethnic minorities and Muslims because they will be labelled racist. You mean this Tommy Robinson?
Can I get a taxi? Taxi?
Taxi.
Little kid drives car.
Sounds pretty racist to me. Both Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray speak of the white working class like they represent them. Ironically, both of them are university educated, posh, upper class men who have nothing in common with working class people whatsoever. The only reason you're bigging up the bigot Yaxley Lenin is because he is a fellow Zionist.
If there was a war and it kicked off, I would be there on the front line fighting for Israel.
Let's look at the next clip where Douglas goes through the far-right checklist of blaming others for your own pitfalls.
So in the last, we're talking 16 years, of the jobs created since 2008, 74% have gone to people who were not born in Britain. The government, it is seen to be extremely lax on policing certain social cohesion issues. It's extremely eager to crack down on anyone of a Tommy Robinson type. What material benefits have come about in the society in the last 16 years have largely gone to people who were not born in the country. The police and authorities, even when you have discovery of an imam in a mosque preaching violence, everyone is incredibly careful, lawyers at all the newspapers and everyone else, to make sure that it isn't implied that everyone who attends that mosque is somehow in favor of this. In fact, woe betide you if you did do that. You have to say it's this one person and no one else is responsible. But somehow the actual desire to tar anyone who has, as I say, not got a voice and is wanting to make their voice heard as, you know, as a violent far-right neo-Nazi seems to me to be a big error by Keir Starmer and others.
So according to Douglas Murray, the majority 80% white British population are being discriminated against by the majority white British government and the majority white British police. This is in terms of employment and punishment for crimes. And by the way, no disrespect to the white community, but a lot of the jobs immigrants take are the jobs native Brits don't want to do, such as cleaners, nail salon assistants, washing cars, delivery drivers, etc. And you're seriously trying to spin the yarn that Muslims and minorities get preferential treatment from the police over white people? That's just a flat out lie. Could it be there's a lot of people hiding behind anonymous accounts, spamming social networks with racist and Islamophobic comments and images? And just because you don't consider your bigotry a crime doesn't mean there's a two-tier policing system. We live in a democracy with laws in place that we all have to abide by, whether we agree with them or not. If Muslims had rioted the way the far right did, it would have been labelled an act of extremism, and they would have probably been taken out by armed police. Murray also outlandishly went on to say that the media also protects Muslims over non-Muslims. How ridiculous a claim. The media are the main instigators of spreading anti-Muslim propaganda over many decades. Just have a look online of their coverage of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Actually, you don't have to go that far back. Look at their coverage of Israel and Palestine, and it's apparent they do not favour Muslims whatsoever. But let's just imagine that in some cuckoo land that Douglas's claims were real. The government was elected by the people of a Western nation, the police are following a Western system of policing, the immigration policies are Western, and the mainstream media is a Western invention. These are all internal problems created by the West. Why blame immigrants or Muslims instead of fixing your own perceived failings? Let's look at the next clip where Jordan Peterson ridiculously insinuates that the far right are made up of Muslims and leftists. You can't make this stuff up.
Ever since I came out in defense of the defensive response of Israel to the October 7th massacre, I've had no shortage of far-right trolls on my case. And I know what they're like, studying them historically. And of course, that happened to me when I partnered with the Daily Wire to begin with, because its head man in some ways, at least in the public eye, was Ben Shapiro. And so I'm perfectly aware of what the far-right agitators look like. And they're a remarkably despicable bunch. The idea that they're in the same camp, for example, as the working class protesters that you're describing in the UK is absurd. We can't admit for a moment that there might be some reason to be leery, let's say, of an immigrant class that would be associated with the kind of education that the madrasas are producing for all sorts of ideological reasons. We can't make any allowance for the idea that some immigrants might be more difficult to integrate into our culture than others. And we find out that there are people who don't have democracies in their own country because they don't have the culture for it, let's say, or the desire for it. And they bring those attitudes along with them. Surprise, surprise, because they weren't just freedom-loving, oppressed people striving to be free, who are now thrilled to death to be in a democratic country, but people who are pretty damn prone to bring all of the problems that they had in their own country along with them.
Okay, so it seems like Jordan is having yet another delusional episode. Maybe it's some sort of delayed withdrawal symptom from the Valium. He is actually saying that his October 7th tweet and his allegiance to the Daily Wire was met by backlash from the far right. The last time I checked, the backlash was mainly from the Muslim community, as well as from some liberal and conservative pro-Palestinian voices. Peterson seems a little confused about who the far right consists of. Michaela really needs to make sure his pills are topped up before he does these podcasts. Peterson then makes the outlandish statement that the UK rioter thugs are not far right, and actually calls them working class protesters. The fact is, the far right love Israel because their violence against Muslims resonates deeply with them, hence why Peterson is protecting them. He then goes on to make the accusation that immigrants that are educated in madrasas are the ones that we need to watch because of their, as he calls it, freedom-hating culture. This whole exercise with Douglas Murray was nothing more than a PR stunt to disguise opposition of Muslim immigration to the West as an intellectual discussion, whilst painting Israel as a heroic nation. However, the reality is that those who are indoctrinated into Zionism are more prone to extremism than people who follow Islam, because Zionists display and act out a level of supremacy unrivaled by any other group, as we are all currently seeing in real time in Palestine. It is the most extreme and dangerous ideology of the past century. Let's take a look at the next clip.
What is it that the West has right, that the enemies of the West have wrong, that's percolating at the bottom of all of this mess, that's driving what? That's driving the relativistic arguments of the pro-immigration types, but that's also fulminating this terrible clash of cultures that we unsurprisingly see emerging on our streets.
And you just crunch the numbers on people in sub-Saharan Africa who want to move into Europe, for instance. And if that happened, if the third of sub-Saharan Africa who want to move moved, Europe would totally unrecognizable. America was based on an idea, but the idea came about because of the people who founded the Republic, the United States of America. And if they hadn't...
Englishmen.
Right.
Imagine that now you're motivated to center the marginal at all cost. And you presume to begin with, because you're naive or corrupt, that those marginal are a community and they're a community with something in common apart from their marginalization. Well, that's certainly the claim of the alphabet mob, for example. We're all a community. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. It doesn't look like it. It looks to me like you're a plurality united by your, what would you say, your resentment. And there's been an all-out assault, let's say, against the structure of marriage. And the consequence of that is that many people aren't married.
Why is it now so completely predictable that an Olympic Games will have to open with a bearded drag queen being the center of attention and a very obese trans person?
Well, the confusion about what constitutes a woman is a cardinal example of that. It's like we're so lost that we can't agree on the distinction between the sexes.
Jordan said the West has it right, and those that oppose the West have it wrong. What he means is his dark Zionist enabling Islamophobic corner of the West has it right. But what about the other more central Western conservatives? And let's not forget the Western liberals. Forget those that oppose the West, that are not from the West, clashing with the culture of the West. The various political ideologies within the West itself clash in a spectacular fashion. And Jordan defeated his own argument by referring to exactly this when he spoke about the alphabet community in the West, the gender confusion in the West, as well as people rejecting marriage due to unfair laws and non-religious values, you guessed it, in the West. None of this is imported through immigration. It is all a creation of the West. The decline is an inside job, Jordan, and thus you are a deceptive hypocrite and a walking contradiction for not making these things the main issue. And speaking of walking contradictions, Douglas Murray said if Africans came to Europe in large numbers, Europe would become unrecognisable. And in the same breath, he goes on to congratulate the British for colonising and settling in America and making it unrecognisable to the indigenous native Indian population who were already there. I completely get it, guys. What you're saying is, if people of colour immigrate to white nations in large numbers, it's not okay. But if it's the other way around, you think it's fine. Wow, talk about ignorance to the 9th degree. And Douglas threw his own alphabet community under the bus by speaking ill about the Olympics. These guys can't even practice tolerance towards fellow Westerners that belong to different communities and political ideologies. So it's no surprise they have discriminatory views against foreigners. At this point, you guys just sound insane. Let's look at the last clip.
How come anyone can move here and immediately become us? And the answer is that's not clear at all. Diversity is our strength is possibly the main mantra of British and European societies now. And actually, again, as mantras go, is false. It wasn't great that Ali Harbi Ali's parents moved from Somalia to the UK, got asylum, and their son then machined an MP to death. We didn't need the Ali family to bring the worst of the war zones of Somalia to the streets of a British constituency. When you hear people saying things, insisting, everybody insisting all the time, diversity is our strength, people know it's a lie. That's certainly what I saw in Israel. The absolute epitome of unconstrained hate that was unleashed on Israel on the 7th. Communities, by the way, in the south of Israel, precisely overpopulated by people who dreamed the dream of peace with their neighbors.
Well, there's also reliable evidence, Douglas, that the children of immigrants are more likely to be radicalized than the immigrants themselves.
Absolutely. It's reverse integration.
Yeah, especially if they're having a hard time integrating.
So what Douglas is saying is that just because you are a person of colour born in Britain or Europe, he thinks that does not make you British or European. I've heard this quite a lot recently and I completely disagree. He then went on to employ his usual tactic of citing an isolated incident involving a Somalian asylum seeker with a Muslim name committing a horrible crime as an example of why racial and religious diversity does not work. Once again, most Muslims condemn all acts of extremism, especially from those that claim to be from our community. Douglas then concluded his ludicrous claim that diversity is a bad thing by bringing in his paymasters Israel as an example of failed diversity, with the non-Israelis being at fault, of course. What Murray failed to mention was how Israel has two sets of laws favouring Israelis over Palestinians. He also failed to mention that Palestinians are not allowed to roam freely in their own country, but Israelis are. And he failed to mention Palestinians can have their homes taken from them by Jewish settlers from anywhere in the world in the drop of a hat, because Israel allows it. And of course, he forgot to say that Israel has been bombing Palestinian Muslims and Christians non-stop for around a year now. Israel does not practice diversity. They practice apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and what they are doing is downright evil. No human being is superior to another because of skin color or culture like these idiots would have us believe through their discriminatory propaganda wrapped up in big words and flowery language designed to deceive the ignorant. These men are actually doing the radicalization they are accusing immigrants of doing by polluting unsuspecting minds using their glossy messaging on their massive Zionist-funded platform with the goal of reaching and corrupting millions of people. Thank you for watching. Make sure to join my free Telegram group via the link in the description, where we as Muslims can speak freely and without censorship about issues like this. And remember to like, subscribe and become a channel member for access to exclusive content. Until next time, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allah.